Thank you for joining us tonight for the last presentation of the day. We originally had Arthur Chow, COO from 6 Waves, scheduled to speak tomorrow in the social games track. But as it turns out, he has to fly from here all the way to London and then all the way to Hong Kong tomorrow. So there was no way that he was going to be able to make the time frame that we had for tomorrow. So we moved him ahead, and we're going to start the social discussion a little bit early today. So with that, let me turn it over to Arthur Chow, COO of 6 Waves, to talk about how to be successful in the social games market. Arthur?
Right. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you very much for joining this session. I know it's been a long day for a lot of you, but just be patient. This is the last session before you can go party tonight, and I'll be quick. So I'm the COO and also the co-founder of 6 Waves. So my agenda is relatively simple and short. I want to make it quite to the point. So I'll talk a little bit about 6 Waves and the overall social gaming market. And then I want to share with you some of our observations about traditional games and social games. And then to wrap it up, as a summary, we want to share with you 6 tips on launching successful social games on the platforms. So just to start with, who is 6 Waves? So we are the largest independent publisher on Facebook. We have about 40 million monthly active users on Facebook all over the world. And we have over 260 million user relationships. These are the email database that we have collected from our applications and also from our games over the years. The users that we have are actually quite well distributed. About 29 to 30% of the people are from the US, about 30% from Europe, 30% from Asia, and then the rest being coming from rest of the world. Right now, we have 4 global offices with over 170 employees. So we originally started in Hong Kong, and then we have expanded into San Francisco in the US, and then we also have an office in Tokyo, and we have an office in Beijing, China. So we have offices over the world to better serve our developer partners and also help them to bring the games to countries in different countries all over the world. At the moment, we have about 45 games on the Facebook platform and about 6 games on the Japanese platform. And we have just recently launched another 2 games in the Korean social networks. So this is a slide taken from DigiCapital projections on the overall gaming market. So as you can see at the bottom, the console game is growing, but it's relatively slow. The major growth in the coming years is coming from online games and also mobile games. And they expected by the year 2014, there will be the online game and the mobile gaming market is about $44 billion US. So some more interesting data. This is recently from a Lazard Capital Markets report. So over the 5 years till 2015, game as a service would experience a 16% compound growth. Whereas games as a product, they expected there's a 1% decline in the overall revenue. And of the games as a service within which virtual goods sales, they expected a 19% compound annual growth rate over the 5-year period to $22.5 billion US as a market. And within that, social games would represent about $8.9 billion, and then social mobile games that represent about $5.2 billion US. So you see that based on different reports, the markets for social games or games as a service is still very, very optimistic. So here we just want to share a little bit about observations from a traditional and a social gaming perspective. So I think the major distinction is that traditionally games have been produced as a product. For example, like EA's Sims. So they're developed and then they put in a box and then they ship into the customer as a product. But now games has been evolved as a service. So there's like an ongoing relationship with the user, and you have to provide ongoing service to the user and provide updates to the users. So again, based on the same game IP, EA also launched the Sims Social on the Facebook platform, and has been doing very, very well. So I think one of the major distinction between traditional and social game is the user psychology. So for traditional games, the players actually have already paid when they buy the product. So the way they treat the game is very different. They are more motivated in a way to find value in the game because they are already paid. They don't want to think they're a fool because they pay money for a game that is not worth the money. So they're actually more tolerant to any imperfection on the game. And they're more willing to learn a new user experience that the game actually provides. And because they have already made the investment and paid the money, overall, they're more willing to be taught what the developer wants them to behave. Social gaming, on the other hand, is very different because the user has never paid for the game yet. I mean, most of the social games are based on a freemium model where you can just play without paying, and whatever you pay is optional. So the players, they're more willing to try the game, but they're looking for value in the game. So the retention is going to be more difficult. And because it doesn't really cost them to start the game, they're also very easy to switch to another game. So general rule is that you don't want to make the game too complex and scare them away. And also because of that, they're less willing to learn a new user experience. So we feel that based on our experience, looking at the best social game design, it shouldn't be too complex. It should be very easy to engage the user and start playing. And once they got hooked to the game, once they start investing into the game in terms of their time and effort, then they're more willing to come back, and they're more willing then to start spending money into the game. So they don't need to be taught, but you want to make sure that whatever they do in the game, the gameplay and the game mechanics, is something that is almost kind of built in. It's something natural for the users. Now the industry barriers, so to enter into the traditional games, it's also much higher. The cost of developing traditional games is usually a lot more. You need bigger teams, and you usually need probably 2 to 3 years to develop a really, really good game for the console or even for web. Now for social games, it's a lot very different. The entry barriers is very, very low. Anyone can develop a social game and put it on, for example, a Facebook platform. And also, it usually takes probably a year ago, you take about 3 to 4 months to develop a social game. Now the games are getting more complex, but still for 6 months, you can develop a very, very good social game. So the time to market and the investment that you need to make is actually much, much lower. But then at the same time, that means it's also a lot of genre has not been played out yet on the social game. Many, many developers are still experiencing and experimenting different kind of games to the users. So there's actually a lot of opportunity for new games that will be popular on the social platforms. So this, we feel, kind of summarize as a developer working in a traditional game versus as a developer working in a social platform. So for the traditional games developer, you work really hard for version 1. You launch it, and then you celebrate. You take a ski trip. And then you come back and work on version 2. And then you launch it, do well, then you do another vacation. You go for a diving trip. And then you come back, you launch your 3rd version. Again, you do well, so you earn a vacation, so you just celebrate. Now, a social game developer, on the other hand, you work and work and work, because game is a service. You really never kind of like, you finish a game, you push it out, and then you take a break. That doesn't really happen in good social games. A good social games, after you launch it, that's where your user community starts to come in. That's where you have to put in your new features. That's where you have to put in your new virtual items and do promotion. So the work is a lot more like an ongoing service. So the build, test, deploy process for traditional is really, it's very distinctive. It's step by step. And when all the features and the contents has been completed, usually the developers can then slow down, and then they wind down off the project. You either take a break, work on a new project, or you just wait for a while until you work on a new version. And then usually the code and the assets, they got frozen, and then the QA is very much distinctive. They just work on the bug fixing phase before they launch the game. The social game, on the other hand, the build, test, deploy process, they're more tightly coupled. And they're always kind of like being run in parallel. And then the code and assets, they never got frozen. They kind of like had this feedback loop on a weekly basis, if not bi-weekly basis, where the developers would take the user suggestions and then just go back and improve the game, and then they launch new versions. So you have a lot of mini runs and updates for social games. And then when we talk about monetization, it's also very, very different. Now, the traditional game, usually the revenue is upfront. So the people, they come, they buy the product, and then they pay you the money. And then for post-launch revenue, usually they come in the form of content expansion packs, or for sometimes they come in when you have a new version. Then they can go out and then they buy a new box again. But then, although you have the revenue upfront, then the investment upfront is also much higher. You need a bigger team size, and then you also have to suffer a longer development cycle, which means you need more funding to continue to pay your salary and rent and the operating costs before you can launch your game and start getting the revenue back. Social games, on the other hand, most of them, they're actually based on the freemium model, which means the monetization strategy is very different because you will not charge the user any fees when they start to play the game. But that doesn't mean monetization is not important. Actually, it's even more important because when you design the game, you have to figure out where are the monetization points for the game. How will the user behave, and when will the user start paying money for your game? So usually, most of the freemium models, they either charge for content, which most of the time, for each user, they purchase one time. So for example, you have a nice avatar, or you have a nice tool, or you have a nice house. They will buy it, but they usually buy for one time. Although many users could potentially buy the same house, but the potential profit is relatively low because the same user may not continue to buy it. On the other hand, service items can be built once, but then they can sold many times to the same user. So therefore, the potential revenue return and the return on investment for service items can be much higher. So for example, a lot of social games, they have this element where you build something and it takes time for you to come back for something to happen. But sometimes you can actually pay for having that speed up. So in terms of waiting for 12 hours, you can actually get that done immediately. Or sometimes when you have something to work on a social game, you need to invite friends to help to make that happen. Again, for some of the users, they just want to pay and make that happen immediately. This type of service items, we find out is a lot more attractive in terms of revenue because the same user can actually buy more and more of that same items as they play the games. So this is the actual graph that tracked the revenue of one of our games. We hide obviously the name and also the actual number because of confidentiality reasons. But as you see, every time when they do a launch of new items or a new event, you see their revenue bumps. So these are actually carefully planned activities of the game to ensure that there's actually new items and things to keep the users occupied and come back, and give them a reason for them to spend money on the game. And you will notice that actually these activities are done on a weekly or sometimes bi-weekly basis. So this is the idea that we talked earlier, that you have to ensure that it's an ongoing service that you provide to your users or customers, and you have to do it on a very frequent basis. So live ops, this is also very different between a traditional and also a service, a social game. So community management for traditional games tends to be nice to have. You ship the product and then that's it. You don't don't actively manage your community to ensure they come back and play the game and ensure that they feel happy about purchasing the game. And then also your new content usually happen independently from your player feedback because there's no active channels to collect your players' feedback, and you just kind of do your new games, new items updates on your own or based on some feedback, but not a very active interactive process. And also your game patches and updates, they usually happen rather infrequently, not at the same time. The social game is very different. Community management actually plays a very, very important part for social games. This is where you encourage your own developer teams to interact with your user to get their feedback. And then based on that feedback, you can do some really quick changes to your game. And usually once you do the changes and then you also communicate back to your users, these gestures are usually very, very well accepted by the users. For example, on Facebook game, usually the developers will also maintain an application wall, and there's a lot of communication between users on the wall, and all the other users can actually see the conversations going on. So the more time you invest in your community management, and based on the feedback you do the changes on the game, the more appreciative will be your users, and then that helps a lot on your retention, and they will just come back and play the game more, and then the pay rate of the game will also usually be increased. And also, based on the feedback, as I mentioned earlier, the updates will be done more frequently. I mean, that's how powerful it is if you have a really good community management team. So that's basically kind of like our observation about the major differences between game as a service versus game as a product, and how you distinguish between a traditional game and a social game. So just to sum up, we want to provide some tips for those who are interested in doing a social game. Some of what I've already kind of mentioned during the presentation, but just to sum up, I think when you're thinking about doing a social game, what is really, really important is to think about how to take advantage of the social graph. The social game is more interesting because a lot of times the user is not playing by himself. You can play with your friends. And also sometimes through the game, you can actually make new friends. So how can you actually take advantage of that social graph and make the game more engaging and also more interesting? It's something that's very, very different from traditional games, and also very, very different from a lot of other kind of like casual games. And then the other point is you want to get big really, really fast. On the social platforms now, there are actually a lot of developers getting onto the platforms, and there are sometimes very competitive too. So once you had a good idea, once you get attraction, once you get good user feedback, you really have to expand fast and try to get as many users as possible. Because otherwise, the other competitors will come in and they will do a very similar game, and they will start spending, and then it will be very difficult to continue to grow the game once the other bigger competitors come in and do something similar. The third point is user retention. So let's say you have a good game and you take advantage of the social graph and you get big fast. Now, if you cannot retain the user well, if they just come try the game and then they just leave, then on the longer term, you cannot really continue the momentum and to grow the game. Especially, we mentioned earlier, a lot of social games, the switching cost is really, really low because it's free. So you have to make sure there are mechanics in the game where there's a reason for user to come back every day, if not every day, every few days. So the better social games out there, they're very, very good user retention programs where you can come back and you get daily bonuses. And if you don't come back for a few days, they will send you an email to remind you something's new going on with the game, or something's new that is going on within your own game on what's happening. So all these user retention features is very, very important to your game. Now, so you get a lot of users and you get a good retention. But ultimately, you have to think about how do you encourage your user to start paying with the game. Because the more users you have, but if the pay rate is really low, that means your operating cost is really, really high, because you have to maintain your web servers, you have to continue to do updates. So you really have to think about how do you entice them to start paying for the products and paying for the items within the game. One thing we want to share is that the Facebook platform now is over 700 million users over the world. And there are a lot of users who are interested in playing games in different countries. So for example, Six Ways, as we publish games, we usually localize the game into at least 6 to 7 languages, sometimes even up to 10 languages. And don't underestimate the potential additional revenue that the gamers from different countries can give you. So when you think about designing the game, also think about how you can take advantage of localizing that game into many different countries and many different languages. And then last of all, pay attention to the metrics. We have detailed data analysis on the metrics that we collected on social games. And we use this feedback, the data, to continue to improve the game, to fine-tune the game, so that you, based on these numbers, you can then have better retention, better user acquisition, better virality, and obviously better monetization. And we keep encouraging the developers to do A/B testing. Try it out, see if it works. Because sometimes you don't spend too much time doing study group and our debate within your company whether we want to do this feature or that feature. The better way is really just to launch it, test it, based on the data, then we can then make the decision and do quick fine-tuning. So these are kind of like the general tips that, based on our experience working with different developers and also through our own development, I think it's very important for doing social games. So if you're ready to try, if you want to also kind of expand your current businesses and activities on the social gaming platform, we actually have recently announced there's a 6L fund, which is set up a $10 million fund to provide support for independent developers who are interested in doing social games, and also not just social games on the PC platform, but also games on the mobile platforms. So if you're interested, there are more detail on this particular website. And we also have a booth downstairs if you want to talk to us and learn a bit more, how you can potentially get funding for your ideas and your development. We are more than happy to talk more and meet up with you. So I think that pretty much concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much. Questions for Arthur? You fried their brains. It's too late.
It's late, I know, I understand. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Arthur, for a great presentation. Have a safe trip back tomorrow.
All right, thanks.